Nestled deep in the heart of a lush green forest, surrounded by towering pine trees that whispered secrets to the wind, there was a quaint little cabin. It wasn't fancy or modern like the homes you'd see in magazines, but it had charm. Real charm. The kind of charm that came from years of stories, laughter, and memories etched into its wooden walls. This cabin belonged to Jack Harper, a man who loved nothing more than spending his days fishing on the shimmering lake that stretched out behind the property like a mirror reflecting the sky above. Jack's connection to this place ran deeper than just ownership. It was part of his soul. His grandfather had built the cabin decades ago as a retreat for the family, a place where they could escape the noise of city life and reconnect with nature. When Jack inherited the cabin after his grandfather passed away, he made it his mission to keep the legacy alive. Every summer, without fail, he packed up his things, drove out to the cabin, and spent weeks soaking in the beauty of the land. He fished during the day, hiked through the woods in the afternoons, and sat by the fire at night listening to the crickets chirp and the water lap gently against the shore. The cabin wasn't isolated, though. It stood on the edge of Willow Creek Estates, a gated community filled with polished houses and manicured lawns. Most of the residents here were professionals, doctors, lawyers, business people, who enjoyed the quiet luxury of living close to nature while still having all the comforts of modern life. Compared to their sleek homes, Jack's cabin looked almost out of place, like an old photograph tucked between glossy magazine pages. But Jack didn't mind. To him, the cabin wasn't about appearances, it was about authenticity. And besides, the neighbors mostly left him alone, content to admire the picturesque view of the lake from afar. What Jack didn't know, however, was that trouble was brewing beneath the surface. You see, the lake wasn't just any ordinary body of water. It was special. Its waters were crystal clear, teeming with fish and framed by tall trees that created a natural canopy overhead. Over time, the residents of Willow Creek Estates had grown fond of the lake, using it for boating, swimming, and even hosting small gatherings along its banks. They treated it as if it were communal property, never questioning who actually owned it. After all, no one had ever brought it up before. The lake simply existed, a shared treasure for everyone to enjoy. But unbeknownst to the residents, the lake, and much of the surrounding land, belonged entirely to Jack. His grandfather had purchased not only the cabin, but also the acres of wilderness around it, including the lake itself, long before Willow Creek Estates was even conceived. The original deed clearly stated that the lake was private property, meaning Jack had every right to decide how it was used, or not used. For years, this fact went unnoticed because Jack rarely enforced his rights. He liked seeing people enjoy the lake, and as long as they respected the environment, he saw no harm in sharing it. One sunny afternoon, Jack decided to spend the day doing what he loved most: fishing. Armed with his trusty rod, a bucket for bait, and a thermos of coffee, he set off toward his favorite spot near the center of the lake. As he cast his line into the calm waters, he noticed something unusual. A group of neighbors had gathered on the shoreline, chatting animatedly and gesturing in his direction. At first, Jack thought nothing of it. Maybe they were planning a picnic or organizing some sort of event. But as he watched them closely, he realized their attention was focused squarely on him. Curiosity got the better of him, so he waved politely, hoping to break the tension. Instead of waving back, one of the neighbors, a woman wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard, pointed directly at him and said something to the others. Whatever she said caused the group to erupt into murmurs, their expressions ranging from confusion to outright disapproval. Jack felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. Something wasn't right. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack returned to the cabin with a handful of freshly caught fish. Despite the strange encounter earlier, he tried to shake off the unease and focus on the peacefulness of the evening. Sitting on the porch, he sipped his coffee and listened to the sounds of the forest coming alive. Frogs croaked, owls hooted, and somewhere in the distance, a fox rustled through the underbrush. It was moments like these that reminded Jack why he cherished this place so much. But peace is often fleeting, especially when you least expect it. The next morning, as Jack stepped outside to fetch firewood, he spotted something unexpected: a piece of paper wedged under the door of his cabin. Picking it up, he unfolded the sheet and read the contents. It was a letter from the Homeowners Association, HOA, of Willow Creek Estates. The tone was formal and stern, accusing Jack of violating community regulations. According to the letter, fishing on the lake required prior approval from the HOA board, which he had allegedly failed to obtain. Even worse, the letter demanded that he cease all activities immediately or face potential consequences, including possible eviction. Jack stared at the words, his mind racing. Eviction? From his own land? He read the letter again, certain he must have misunderstood. But no matter how many times he scanned the lines, the message remained the same. Frustration bubbled inside him. How dare they try to dictate what he could do on his own property? Shaking his head, Jack muttered to himself, "They've got to be kidding." Still, he knew better than to ignore the situation. Determined to clear up the misunderstanding, Jack grabbed his phone and dialed the number listed at the bottom of the letter. After a few rings, a woman answered. Her voice was clipped and professional, identifying herself as Beverly Thompson, the president of the HOA board. Jack explained his side of the story, emphasizing that he owned the lake and therefore had every right to fish there. To his surprise, Beverly didn't sound convinced. In fact, her tone grew colder with each word he spoke. "Mr. Harper," she said firmly, "the lake has always been considered a shared resource by our community. Your claim of ownership is questionable, to say the least." Questionable? Jack couldn't believe what he was hearing. Before he could respond, Beverly added, "If you wish to contest this matter, I suggest you bring proof to our next meeting. Until then, we expect full compliance with our rules." With that, she hung up, leaving Jack staring at his phone in disbelief. Proof? He had proof. The original deed to the property was safely stored in a drawer inside the cabin, complete with a detailed map showing the boundaries of his land, including the lake. But as Jack thought about the conversation, a new realization dawned on him. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. The HOA wasn't going to back down easily, and neither was he. If they wanted proof, he'd give it to them. But he doubted it would end there. For now, Jack decided to bide his time. He finished stacking the firewood and retreated indoors, his mind swirling with questions. Why were they targeting him? Did they truly believe they had a claim to his lake? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go to challenge him? One thing was certain: this was only the beginning of what promised to be a long and complicated battle. The next few days passed in a blur for Jack. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like the calm before a storm. The letter from the HOA had rattled him more than he cared to admit. At first, he thought it was just a silly misunderstanding, a bureaucratic mix-up that could be resolved with a quick phone call or a brief chat. But Beverly's cold tone during their conversation made it clear this wasn't going to be easy. Her dismissive attitude stuck with him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. How could they claim ownership over something that wasn't theirs? It didn't make sense. Jack spent the morning pacing around the cabin, trying to figure out his next move. He knew he had the upper hand. The deed to the property was ironclad proof of his ownership. But he also knew that legal battles could get messy. People rarely backed down when pride was involved, especially people like Beverly Thompson, who seemed determined to assert authority no matter what. Still, Jack wasn't about to roll over and let them push him around. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about standing up for what was rightfully his. Determined to prepare himself, Jack dug out the old metal box where he kept important documents. Inside, carefully folded and slightly yellowed with age, was the original deed to the property. His grandfather had always been meticulous about record keeping, and now Jack was grateful for it. Unfolding the paper, he studied the details again, tracing the lines of the map with his fingers. There was no ambiguity here. The lake, the surrounding, Woods and even part of the shoreline were all listed as part of his inheritance. Satisfied, Jack tucked the deed into a folder along with copies of other supporting documents, property tax records, historical maps, and correspondence from years past confirming his family's ownership. But having proof wasn't enough. Jack needed to present it to the HOA in a way that left no room for argument. That meant attending one of their meetings and facing the board head-on. He checked the schedule posted online and found that the next meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Perfect timing, he thought. If there was ever a moment to set things straight, this was it. As the day approached, Jack felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him. On one hand, he was confident in his case. The facts were undeniable, and he trusted that reason would prevail. On the other hand, he couldn't ignore the nagging doubt creeping into his mind. What if they refused to listen? What if they twisted the truth to suit their narrative? These questions haunted him, but he pushed them aside. He reminded himself why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for his grandfather's legacy. Giving up wasn't an option. Thursday arrived, and Jack drove to the community center where the HOA meetings were held. The building was modern and sleek, a stark contrast to his rustic cabin. Large windows overlooked manicured gardens, and the parking lot was filled with expensive cars. As Jack stepped out of his truck, he noticed several neighbors glancing his way, whispering to each other. Some looked curious, others hostile. He ignored them, clutching the folder tightly in his hand as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Rows of chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and a long table at the front served as the stage for the HOA board members. Beverly sat in the center, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. To her left and right were other board members equally stern-faced. Jack took a seat near the back, waiting for the meeting to begin. Around him, residents chatted quietly, though most conversations seemed to revolve around him. He caught snippets of phrases like, "That guy thinks he owns everything," and "He's ruining the neighborhood," which only fueled his determination to prove them wrong. Finally, Beverly called the meeting to order. After a few routine announcements about landscaping schedules and holiday decorations, she turned her attention to Jack. "We have received reports of unauthorized activity on Willow Creek Lake," she announced, her voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Specifically, fishing without proper authorization." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Mr. Harper has kindly agreed to address the board regarding these allegations." Jack stood up, his heart pounding but his resolve steady. Walking to the front of the room, he placed the folder on the table and faced the crowd. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, clearing his throat, Jack began to speak. "As some of you may know," he started, his tone calm but firm, "this cabin and the land it sits on have been in my family for generations. My grandfather purchased this property decades ago, including the lake and its surrounding acres. I have documentation proving my ownership, and I'd like to share it with you today." He opened the folder and handed copies of the deed and other papers to each board member. As they flipped through the pages, murmurs rippled through the audience. Some looked skeptical, while others seemed genuinely surprised. Beverly, however, remained unmoved. When she finally spoke, her voice dripped with skepticism. "While these documents are certainly interesting," she said, arching an eyebrow, "they don't change the fact that the lake has been treated as communal property for years. Residents rely on it for recreation and enjoyment. You can't simply claim exclusive control based on outdated paperwork." Her words sparked a wave of agreement among the crowd. One man stood up, pointing an accusatory finger at Jack. "You're being selfish," he exclaimed. "This lake belongs to all of us." Another neighbor chimed in, shaking her head. "It's not fair to take something away that we've come to depend on. Think about the kids who swim here in the summer." The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as accusations flew. Jack listened, his jaw tightening. He hadn't expected such hostility. Taking a deep breath, he raised his hands to quiet the crowd. Slowly the noise subsided, and all eyes returned to him. "I understand how much this lake means to you," Jack said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "But the truth is, it's my lake. My family owned it long before Willow Creek Estates existed. I've never tried to stop anyone from using it because I believe in sharing. But that doesn't mean I'm obligated to give up my rights entirely." His words did little to appease the angry residents. A woman seated near the front leaned forward, her expression defiant. "If you really cared about the community, you wouldn't bring this up now. Why stir the pot?" Jack sighed, realizing that logic alone wouldn't win them over. Emotions were running high and facts seemed secondary to their sense of entitlement. He glanced at Beverly, hoping for a shred of fairness, but her stony gaze offered none. Instead, she addressed the room once more. "Thank you, Mr. Harper, for presenting your perspective," she said, emphasizing the last word with a note of disdain. "However, the board will need time to review these documents and discuss the matter further. We'll reconvene next week to make a final decision." With that, the meeting adjourned, leaving Jack standing alone at the front of the room. The crowd dispersed quickly, many shooting him disapproving looks as they left. Jack gathered his papers and headed back to his truck, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. He had done everything he could to reason with them, but it felt like talking to a brick wall. They weren't interested in listening. They just wanted to protect their version of reality. On the drive home, Jack replayed the events in his mind, replaying every exchange, every accusation. It was exhausting, but he refused to let it break him. If anything, the hostility only strengthened his resolve. He realized now that this wasn't just about the lake, it was about power. The HOA saw him as a threat to their authority, someone who dared to challenge the status quo. And they weren't going to back down without a fight. When Jack returned to the cabin, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the lake. The sun was setting, casting golden rays across the water. It was beautiful, peaceful, and his. No amount of intimidation or manipulation could change that. As he sipped his coffee, Jack made a silent promise to himself. He would defend what was rightfully his, no matter how hard the battle became. Because sometimes, standing up for what you believe in isn't just about winning, it's about staying true to who you are. The days following the HOA meeting felt like a storm brewing on the horizon. Jack had hoped that presenting his proof would at least spark some level of understanding or compromise, but instead, it seemed to pour fuel onto an already smoldering fire. The hostility he'd encountered wasn't just directed at him. It was aimed at the very idea that someone could challenge the community's long-held assumptions about the lake. To many of his neighbors, the lake wasn't just water. It was part of their identity, woven into the fabric of their lives. And now, Jack was being painted as the villain who threatened to take it all away. At first, the tension simmered quietly. Neighbors avoided eye contact when they passed Jack on the road. Some muttered under their breath as they walked by his cabin, while others shot him cold, accusatory glares. It was subtle, but Jack noticed. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was the truth. But the quiet disdain soon gave way to something far more overt and aggressive. One morning, as Jack stepped outside to check the mail, he spotted a group of men in bright orange vests standing near the edge of his property. They were holding measuring tapes and marking stakes in the ground with small flags. Curious and slightly alarmed, he approached them cautiously. "Excuse me," he called out, raising a hand. "What are you doing here?" One of the men turned around, looking mildly surprised to see Jack. "We're surveying the land for Willow Creek Estates," he replied matter-of-factly. "Just making sure everything aligns with the community boundaries." Jack frowned. "This is private property," he said firmly. "You don't have permission to be here." The man shrugged, unfazed. "Orders from the HOA, we've got a job to do." With that, he went back to work, ignoring Jack completely. Furious, Jack pulled out his phone and called Beverly Thompson. When she answered, her tone was clipped and impatient. "Yes, Mr. Harper?" she asked, as if she already knew why he was calling. "What's the meaning of this?" Jack demanded. "There are people trespassing on my land right now, claiming they're working for the HOA. You can't just send surveyors onto my property without my consent. Beverly sighed audibly as though dealing with a nuisance. We're merely ensuring compliance with community standards, she said smoothly. If your claim of ownership is legitimate, then there's nothing to worry about, is there? Her dismissive attitude only fueled Jack's anger. You're testing me, he shot back, pushing me to see how far I'll let you go. Well, I'm not backing down. Tell your people to leave my property immediately, or I'll call the authorities. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then, with a hint of irritation, Beverly relented. Fine, I'll have them stop for now, but don't think this is over, Mr. Harper. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, Jack found himself constantly on edge. Strange, things started happening around his cabin. One night he woke up to the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. Peering through the window, he saw headlights disappearing into the darkness. In the morning, he discovered deep ruts in the dirt road leading to his property, as though someone had deliberately driven recklessly to damage it. Another time, he returned from a fishing trip to find his mailbox smashed to pieces, lying crumpled on the ground. Then came the signs. Bright yellow placards appeared along the shoreline of the lake declaring it HOA property and warning against unauthorized use. Jack tore them down whenever he found them, but they kept reappearing, like weeds sprouting after rain. It was maddening, a constant reminder that the HOA wasn't going to back down easily. Despite the escalating harassment, Jack refused to give in. He reached out to a lawyer recommended by a friend, a sharp-minded woman named Sarah Collins, who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing Jack's documents and listening to his story, Sarah nodded thoughtfully. You've got a strong case, she told him, but be prepared. This isn't going to be quick or easy. The HOA knows they're in the wrong, which is why they're trying to intimidate you. Don't let them win. With Sarah's guidance, Jack filed a formal complaint against the HOA, citing trespassing, vandalism, and harassment. He also requested a restraining order to prevent them from interfering with his property. The legal process moved slowly, but it gave Jack a sense of control. For the first time since the conflict began, he felt like he was fighting back on equal footing. Meanwhile, the situation at Willow Creek Estates continued to escalate. Word of Jack's lawsuit spread quickly, dividing the community into two camps. Some residents sympathized with him, especially those who had always suspected the HOA of overstepping its bounds. Others doubled down in their support of the association, viewing Jack as an outsider determined to disrupt their way of life. Tensions ran high, and tempers flared during impromptu debates at the local coffee shop or grocery store. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sunset, he heard footsteps approaching. Looking up, he saw a neighbor he vaguely recognized, a middle-aged man named Greg, who lived a few houses down. Greg hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, his hands shoved awkwardly into his pockets. Hey, Jack, he said, his voice uncertain. Can we talk for a minute? Jack raised an eyebrow but gestured for him to sit. Sure. What's on your mind? Greg sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I know things have gotten messy lately. A lot of us are frustrated, but I wanted to say, I believe you. About the lake, I mean. I did some digging myself, and it seems pretty clear that your family has owned this place for a long time. I wanted to apologize for how everyone's been treating you. Jack blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected olive branch. Thanks, he said slowly. I appreciate that. Greg nodded, looking relieved. Not everyone feels the same way, obviously. But I thought you should know. You're not completely alone in this. The conversation lifted Jack's spirits, reminding him that not all hope was lost. Still, the battle was far from over. As autumn settled in, painting the trees in fiery hues of red and gold, Jack braced himself for what lay ahead. The HOA had made it clear they weren't backing down, and neither was he. This fight wasn't just about ownership anymore, it was about principle. About standing firm in the face of adversity and refusing to let fear dictate his actions. Late one night, as the wind howled through the pines and the moon cast silvery light across the lake, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Thought about his grandfather, who had built this cabin with his own hands, dreaming of a place where future generations could find peace. He thought about the countless summers he'd spent here, casting his line into the water and feeling truly alive. And he thought about the people who had tried to take it all away, their greed, their entitlement, their refusal to accept the truth. In that moment, Jack realized something important. No matter how hard they pushed, no matter how many obstacles they threw in his path, they couldn't break him, because this land wasn't just property, it was home. And Jack Harper wasn't the kind of man who gave up on home. The conflict between Jack and the HOA reached a boiling point in the weeks that followed. What had started as a quiet dispute over fishing rights had spiraled into an all-out war, with both sides digging in their heels and refusing to back down. For Jack, it felt like living under a microscope. Every move he made was scrutinized. Every action met with resistance. The HOA wasn't just content to argue. They were determined to make his life as difficult as possible. One evening, after a long day of chopping firewood, Jack decided to take a walk along the edge of the lake. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves, and the water shimmered faintly under the pale light of the moon. It was moments like these that reminded him why this place meant so much to him. But as he rounded a bend near the shoreline, he froze. His heart sank as he took in the scene before him. Several large trees that once stood proudly along the edge of his property had been cut down. Their trunks lay scattered across the ground, hacked apart and left in disarray. Fresh sawdust clung to the breeze, mingling with the smell of destruction. Jack's stomach churned with anger and disbelief. These weren't just any trees. They were part of the forest his grandfather had cherished, part of the natural beauty that made this land special. Someone had deliberately destroyed them, leaving behind only stumps as evidence of their handiwork. As he examined the area more closely, he noticed tire tracks leading away from the site, disappearing into the main road that connected his cabin to Willow Creek Estates. Whoever had done this hadn't even tried to hide it. Fuming, Jack grabbed his phone and called the local sheriff's department to report the vandalism. When the deputy arrived the next morning, he surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "Looks intentional," he said, jotting notes in his pad. "We'll look into it, but without witnesses or security cameras out here, it might be tough to pin down who's responsible." Jack clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling inside him. He didn't need anyone to tell him who was behind this, it was obvious. The HOA had crossed another line, escalating their tactics to outright sabotage. But proving it would be nearly impossible. Still, he refused to let them get away with it. With Sarah Collins's help, he added the tree-cutting incident to his growing list of grievances against the HOA, vowing to hold them accountable in court. But the attacks didn't stop there. Over the next few days, Jack began receiving anonymous letters slipped under his door or left on his porch. Some contained veiled threats, urging him to sell his land and leave peacefully. Others mocked him, calling him stubborn and selfish for refusing to share the lake. One particularly chilling note read simply, "You can't win this fight." Each letter sent a fresh wave of unease through him, but Jack refused to let fear take root. Instead, he saved every single one, knowing they could serve as evidence of harassment later on. Despite the mounting pressure, Jack found solace in the support of a small group of neighbors who believed in his cause. Greg, the man who had apologized, earlier introduced Jack to a few others who shared his frustration with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Together, they formed an informal coalition, meeting secretly at each other's homes to discuss strategy. While most of the community remained firmly aligned with the HOA, these allies gave Jack a sense of solidarity he desperately needed. "They're scared of you," one neighbor, a retired teacher named Linda, told him during one of their meetings. "Not because you're dangerous, but because you're standing up to them. People like Beverly thrive on control, and you're messing with their narrative." Jack nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not trying to pick a fight," he said. "I just want what's mine." "Is that too much to ask?" Linda smiled sadly. "In a world where everyone thinks they're entitled to something for free? Yeah, sometimes it is." As the legal battle dragged on, the tension spilled over into public view. Reporters from local newspapers caught wind of the story and descended upon Willow Creek Estates, eager to cover the dramatic feud between a lone homeowner and a powerful HOA. Headlines like "Man vs. HOA Battle Over Beloved Lake" dominated the front pages, turning Jack's private struggle into a spectacle. Television crews set up cameras outside the community center during HOA meetings, capturing heated arguments and tense exchanges. Social media exploded with opinions, with some people siding with Jack and others defending the HOA's right to regulate communal spaces. For Jack, the sudden attention was overwhelming. On one hand, it felt validating to have strangers recognize the injustice he was facing. On the other hand, the constant spotlight made him feel exposed, like he had no privacy left. Neighbors who had previously ignored him now avoided him completely, embarrassed by the negative publicity surrounding their community. Even the landscape around the lake seemed different somehow. The once peaceful waters now carried an air of hostility, reflecting the discord that had taken hold. Beverly Thompson, ever the master of spin, seized the opportunity to paint Jack as the villain in interviews. "This isn't about ownership," she declared during a televised segment. "It's about preserving the harmony of our community. Mr. Harper wants to exclude everyone else from enjoying the lake, which goes against the spirit of shared resources we've always upheld." Her words infuriated Jack, but he chose not to engage publicly. Instead, he focused on building his case, gathering every piece of evidence he could find to prove his ownership. Sarah Collins worked tirelessly to file motions and counterarguments, ensuring that the HOA couldn't bully him into submission. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn in Jack's favor. During one particularly contentious court hearing, Sarah presented a series of historical documents that traced the lake's ownership back to Jack's grandfather. She highlighted key details in the original deed, emphasizing the clarity of the language and the absence of any ambiguity regarding the boundaries of the property. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding as Sarah dismantled the HOA's claims point by point. When it was Beverly's turn to speak, her usual confidence faltered. Under cross-examination, she struggled to provide concrete evidence, supporting the HOA's assertion that the lake belonged to the community. Her attempts to argue decades of use as justification for ownership fell flat, especially when Sarah pointed out that such arguments held little weight against legally documented property rights. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that the HOA's position was weakening. Yet instead of admitting defeat, they doubled down, launching a smear campaign designed to discredit Jack. Flyers appeared around town accusing him of greed and selfishness, while anonymous social media accounts spread rumors about his motives. Some residents even suggested that Jack was using the lawsuit as a way to extort money from the HOA. Through it all, Jack remained steadfast. He knew the truth would eventually come out, no matter how hard the HOA tried to twist it. And deep down, he understood that this fight wasn't just about him. It was about setting a precedent. If he gave in now, it would send a message that powerful organizations could trample over individual rights without consequence. That wasn't something he was willing to accept. Late one night, as the wind howled through the trees and rain pattered against the roof of the cabin, Jack sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Despite everything he'd been through, the threats, the vandalism, the endless legal battles, he still felt a profound sense of peace whenever he looked out at the lake. This place was more than just land or water. It was a testament to his family's legacy, a symbol of resilience in the face of adversity. He thought about the journey he'd been on, from the early days of blissful solitude to the chaos of the present. It had tested him in ways he never imagined, pushing him to his limits and forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. But it had also shown him the strength he didn't know he possessed. No matter what happened next, Jack knew one thing for certain. He would never stop fighting for what was rightfully his. Because sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about winning, it's about staying true to yourself no matter the cost. The final chapter of Jack's battle with the HOA arrived on a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels sharp and clean, carrying with it the promise of change. After months of legal wrangling, court hearings, and relentless tension, the judge overseeing the case announced that a verdict had been reached. The news spread quickly, sending ripples through Willow Creek Estates. Neighbors whispered nervously about the outcome, unsure of what it would mean for their community, or for Jack. Jack woke up that day feeling a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, he was exhausted. The constant pressure, the sleepless nights, and the unrelenting hostility from some of his neighbors had taken a toll on him. But on the other hand, he felt a flicker of hope, a quiet certainty that justice would prevail. He dressed carefully, choosing clothes that reflected both his respect for the courtroom and his determination to see this through. As he drove to the courthouse, the familiar route passing by the lake and his cabin, he allowed himself a moment to reflect on how far he'd come. When Jack entered the courtroom, it was packed. Reporters scribbled notes in the back rows, cameras clicked softly as photographers captured the scene, and residents of Willow Creek Estates filled the benches, their faces tense with anticipation. Beverly Thompson sat stiffly near the front, her usual air of authority replaced by an uneasy stiffness. She glanced at Jack briefly but looked away just as quickly, unable to meet his gaze. For once she seemed uncertain, vulnerable even. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Everyone stood as the gavel struck once, signaling the start of proceedings. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses before addressing the crowded room. "This has been a lengthy and complex case," he began, his voice steady and measured. "After reviewing all evidence presented by both parties, I am prepared to deliver my ruling." Jack held his breath, his fingers gripping the edge of the table in front of him. The seconds stretched into an eternity as the judge paused, shuffling through his papers. Finally, he spoke again, his words cutting through the silence like a knife. "Based on the documentation provided by Mr. Harper, including the original deed, historical records, and supporting affidavits, it is clear that the lake and its surrounding land are indeed his private property. The claims made by Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association regarding communal ownership lack sufficient legal foundation and cannot override established property rights." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Some people gasped audibly. Others exchanged shocked glances. Beverly's face turned pale, her lips pressed tightly together in a thin line. Jack exhaled deeply, relief washing over him like a warm wave. It was over. He had won. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, "the actions taken by the HOA against Mr. Harper, including trespassing, vandalism, and harassment, are unacceptable and constitute violations of his rights as a property owner. Therefore, I am ordering the HOA to pay restitution for damages incurred during this dispute, including compensation for the destruction of trees on Mr. Harper's property. Additionally, any further interference with Mr. Harper's use of his land will result in immediate legal consequences." The gavel struck again, sealing the verdict. Jack sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the decision sink in. He hadn't expected such a decisive victory. Not only had his ownership been affirmed, but the HOA had been held accountable for their actions. It was more than he could have hoped for. As the crowd dispersed, reporters swarmed around Jack, eager for a statement. Cameras flashed in his face, microphones were thrust toward him, and questions came rapid fire. "How does it feel to win? What will you do now? Do you plan to press additional charges against the HOA?" Jack raised a hand, asking for quiet. When the room settled, he spoke calmly but firmly. "This wasn't about revenge or proving a point," he said. "It was about protecting something precious, not just for me, but for my family. My grandfather built this cabin because he believed in creating a place where future generations could find peace and connection. Today's ruling ensures that legacy can continue." His words resonated with some of the reporters, who nodded, thoughtfully. Others scribbled furiously, capturing every syllable for their stories. As Jack stepped outside the courthouse, the cool breeze greeted him like an old friend. For the first time in months, he felt truly free. Back at the cabin, life slowly returned to normal. or as close to normal as it could be after such a turbulent period. The media attention died down eventually, though occasional articles still popped up online, recounting the David versus Goliath story of one man standing up to a powerful HOA. Jack didn't mind the coverage too much. If anything, it served as a reminder of what he had overcome. The community of Willow Creek Estates, however, remained divided. Some neighbors approached Jack apologetically, admitting they had misjudged him and thanking him for standing his ground. Others avoided him altogether, too embarrassed or resentful to acknowledge him. Beverly Thompson resigned as president of the HOA shortly after the trial, citing personal reasons. Her departure marked a shift within the organization, as new leadership attempted to repair the damage done to the community's reputation. For Jack, the most meaningful interactions came from those who had supported him throughout the ordeal. Greg, Linda, and a few others stopped by regularly, bringing food or simply sitting on the porch to chat. They became more than allies. They became friends. Their solidarity reminded Jack that even in the darkest moments, there were always people willing to stand by your side if you let them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jack sat by the lake with a cup of coffee in hand. The water was calm, mirroring the colors above, like a giant canvas. He thought about everything he had endured, the threats, the vandalism, the endless arguments, and realized that while the scars would remain, they no longer defined him. What mattered was that he had fought for what was right, and won, in the weeks that followed, Jack decided to make a gesture of goodwill. He drafted a letter addressed to the residents of Willow Creek Estates, inviting them to join him for a community cleanup day at the lake. "I want us to move forward together," he wrote. "This place belongs to me, but it's also part of your lives. Let's work together to keep it beautiful for everyone." To his surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Dozens of neighbors showed up on the designated Saturday, armed with gloves, trash bags, and tools. They worked side by side, clearing debris from the shoreline and planting new saplings to replace the trees that had been cut down. There were awkward moments, of course, stilted conversations and lingering tensions, but there were also genuine smiles and shared laughter. By the end of the day, the lake looked better than ever, and so did the relationships within the community. As Jack watched the sunset that evening, surrounded by neighbors who had once been adversaries, he felt a profound sense of closure. The battle had changed him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. It had tested his patience, his resolve, and his faith in humanity, but it had also shown him the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. More importantly, it had reminded him why he loved this place so much, not just for its beauty, but for the lessons it taught him about resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of staying true to yourself. The lake shimmered quietly in the fading light, its surface undisturbed by conflict or chaos. For Jack, it was a symbol of peace, not just the kind found in nature, but the kind earned through hard-fought battles and honest reconciliation. And as he cast his fishing line into the tranquil waters, he smiled, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had already proven himself capable of weathering the storm.